Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. We have the domestic violence and housing presentation from Darrianne Johnson and Heather Ingman out of Dickinson. And if you have any questions, please type them in the chat. And we ask that you keep your microphones on mute and your cameras turned off during the presentation. And if you need a certificate of participation, please contact Stacy after the presentation. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Heather and Darrianne.
Good afternoon. I am Darrianne Johnson. I'm the Executive Director of the Domestic Violence and Rape Crisis Center. And as of September 1st, I will start my 23rd year here.
My name is Heather Ingman. I'm the assistant director and oversee the case managers here. And in the fall, I would have been here for 13 years.
And so you get to listen to our happy voices right after lunch. We're sorry about that. We're going to do a little bit of talking about the VAWA Violence Against Women Act and housing, and give you also a little bit of an overview of what domestic violence is all about. And then Heather will give you some links to some forms that you can look at and use down the road. But before we begin with anything, we just want to let you know that we are by no means experts on this. And truly what we do at our agency is we call whoever we think may know something, and we continue on until we get the right answer. Sometimes it's very difficult to get the answer, but we're persistent, so we usually do get it.
I'll just add to that. Don't be afraid to ask questions. I know we had talked to Cheryl and her team and Kylie yesterday, and if you guys have questions, put them in the chats and they will kind of field them as we go. We want this to be as beneficial for each of you as it possibly can be. And so part of that is being able to ask the questions along the way where it's relevant versus waiting till the end. So.
Okay, we're going to start out, first of all, with some definitions. Domestic violence is a pattern of abusive behavior in a relationship that is used by one partner to maintain power and control over another partner or former intimate partner. Now, there's many different types of domestic violence, and the most, I guess, obvious one is physical abuse, and that is most times what people see. There is also emotional, psychological, verbal abuse. There's economic abuse, which a lot of people have not heard of when we do our presentations. We talk about economic abuse. There is sexual abuse and cultural abuse. I'll just do a little overview of each one. And I can tell you right now, emotional, psychological, and verbal abuse, I have been told over and over and over again by many of the women that I've worked with over the years that they would much rather be punched in the face than be told that they're worthless, useless, ugly, fat, whatever famous words their abusers like to call them. And that kind of abuse takes you down. It takes away your self-worth. It takes away your confidence. It takes away your ability to have relationships with people outside of that relationship. Cultural, when I was doing a little bit of searching today, I found cultural abuse as a new form. And that is where you would have someone who would not allow people to practice their cultural beliefs. And I know in our area, we've had a huge influx of all different types of people. And I can definitely see that one coming up in the future. I think the only other one that needs any explanation would be economic abuse. We saw that very much so when the oil boom hit, when we had men making $15,000-$20,000 a week. They would want their wives and their girlfriends to stay home, and they would bring home all the money, but then they would also be the ones who would decide what was done with that money. And then when the oil boom tanked, we had a lot of women who had not worked and then all of a sudden weren't able to find a job. So economic abuse was very prominent then, and I think even it still is in our area, just because of the farming and ranching that goes on here. Many times we've had women tell us that their husbands give them a certain amount of money to go get groceries, and then they want to see the receipt afterwards to make sure that they're not spending it on anything else. We can go on to sexual assault. Is any type of sexual contact or behavior that occurs without consent of the recipient. There's some other things that fall under sexual assault, such as forced sexual intercourse, sodomy, molestation, incest, fondling, and attempted rape. It includes sexual acts against people who are unable to consent, either due to age or lack of capacity. We can go to dating violence. That is violence and abuse committed by a person to exert power and control over a current or former dating partner. We see an awful lot of that. We see young people who their dating partner starts to isolate them from their friends and family, and then they start doing whatever they want to do to them because this person now has no one to go to. Technology is causing all kinds of problems as far as dating violence goes, and that's for another whole seminar. Stalking is very difficult to prove, and it is a pattern of repeated and unwanted attention, harassment, contact, or any other course of conduct directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. Stalking is very dangerous, but it's very hard to prove. We have actually had women try to take photos from their cell phones to the back when their abuser is following them. Another part of stalking is where the person will be at the place where you are going without you having any idea how they knew you were going to get there. It's very, very it's a mind games. Stalking is very much mind games, and it causes great fear to the person who is being stalked.
And I was just going to preface too, when we look at domestic violence and housing and landlords, I would say sometimes the stalking is the hardest piece for us to work with victims or survivors with. Just, as Darianne said, it's really hard to prove. And so, we see it from our end and we get it, we believe it, and, know it to be true. But when you're trying to convince somebody, especially when it comes down to contracts and leases, they're requesting a significant amount of documentation. So I would say, yeah, on our end, stalking is probably one of the hardest things that we work with against housing. Just in fact of matter, it's by far the hardest to prove. I'm also going to throw a little caveat in here that we should have done at the beginning. Domestic violence has no biases. It doesn't matter who it is. It affects everybody. And so historically, and you'll even see that when we talk about VAWA, historically, domestic violence has always been seen as a female as a victim and a male as an offender. But as most of you know, that's not true. We see quite the opposite pretty regularly. And yeah, holds no age, holds nothing against it. So just kind of preface that, even though we refer to a lot in context as female as the victim, just know that that's not true in what we see every day.
Terry Ann, the sound isn't working on it.
Yep, Heather, the sound, you can't hear it.
Maybe. So we're working now?
Nope.
No. Oh.
Beth says you have to share sound as well as screen, Heather.
Good.
Try it again.
Wow.
We have sound.
Given
Yes,
I
yes.
was a very fit, active girl, you know, what do you think? Was it that bad?
Sorry.
Yeah, it was bad. Strip your clothes off, exploit you sexually.
The broken nose was the first, cracked skull, broken ribs.
That was actually ripped all the way up into my nostril. You could go like that with it.
He would choke me hard enough just to scare the life out of me, to make me and realize that he's capable of killing me.
If we would argue, he would stand over me and it would be like a physical intimidation.
He would never give me a black eye or a split lip because people could see that. It was always, he would hit me where I was covered, so I was always black and blue. I was very colorful.
He was gonna cut my head off with an axe, but he couldn't find the axe. Guess I was lucky there.
He had this habit of getting my children involved. Like he would get my two oldest children to hit me, spit on my face, call me name and stuff like that.
The emotional damage is harder to deal with than the physical damage. Like the physical damage heals, it goes away.
It broke my heart, not because my kids did it. It broke my heart because how can another human being get a child to do that to another human being?
How can I ever explain to someone how it feels to live with someone that you're physically afraid of? Like, how can I?
It's not just bad, it literally ruins your life.
And this is someone who you are so in love with, and I felt like I'd given him everything.
Sorry, folks. Nonprofit Wi-Fi at its best.
And I felt like I'd given him everything.
Each new wave of violence or even the words that come with it, that go along with it, attack another level of yourself.
We're going to reference that video in a little bit, but just kind of keep that in the back of your mind as we kind of go through this. So I can't see who is on the call here on the Zoom, but can everybody put in the chat maybe who is familiar or who is not familiar with the VAWA laws in regard to housing?
Heather, do you want me to go over why don't they leave?
Well, we can do it here when we go to the issues.
It looks like in the chat we have probably even spread of I'm familiar,
Variety.
somewhat, I've heard of it,
Okay.
Yes, familiar somewhat.
Yep. So the Violence Against Women Act, you'll see the acronym a lot for VAWA. What it is what we use a lot in regards to assisting victims in a variety of case scenarios, but for the sake of here, we use it a lot for housing protections. And so you can see that the act in and of itself is federal, and that it provides housing protections for people who are applying for or living in units subsidized by the federal government and who have experienced domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking, to help keep them safe and reduce their likelihood of experiencing homeless again, right? And so there's laws that have been put in place federally that are set out to essentially keep victims of violence in a safe setting, right? Because as we all know, when you don't have housing, your world kind of crumbles before you, right? If you don't have that place to go home to, whatever it may look like for the time being, if that doesn't exist, it's pretty hard to succeed and continue to move forward. And so prior to the VAWA law being in place, what we had been seeing were that victims of violence, regardless of what the violence were being put on the back burner, meaning that the offender or the aggressor were being allowed right over the victim. So a victim would have to relocate, a victim would have to pay themselves out of the lease, a victim would have to, I mean, you can fill in the blank. And so it just made things more complicated. But once VAWA was enacted, there were things in place that, again, just would help keep people housed. Now, the issue, as you will kind of go through, and some of you were familiar of it, some of you were not familiar with it, but what we see more and more is that housing providers are not familiar with it, which is unfortunate, because when you look at a lease, 9 times out of 10, there is something about a VAWA clause in there. And yet when you call to contest it, when you call to utilize it, more often than not, a housing provider, at least I should say that I can speak on the western side of the state. So if Central or East or North Central or Northwest are having a different scenario, I would love to hear that too. But on our end, we're just really not seeing housing providers familiar with it, let alone the documentation that HUD is provided in place that makes it pretty easy to assist a victim of violence. So HUD redid January, February, HUD redid their website. So there is actually and I'll reference it at the end here and give that information. But so HUD redid, if you're not familiar with it, they redid their website and they put a separate section specifically to VAWA. So if you go on there, you'll be able to see the protections that are in place. You'll be able to see who qualifies for VAWA, what agencies are protected under VAWA, what agencies have VAWA stipulations in it, and then documentation and forms that are required. So we're just going to kind of go over a few of the protections here that are in place. And then when we're kind of done with this, we're going to walk through what some of those issues look like and maybe how you can better advocate for your clients who you would find yourself in those positions. So a victim of violence, they cannot be denied admission or assistance to a HUD funded property. And now there are some caveats to that. So again, I'll kind of show you that snapshot of what those programs look like. But just a pretty plain and simple, like they cannot be denied that admission or assistance from that provider based on any prior altercation of domestic violence or any current altercation of domestic violence. They cannot be evicted. So what that would mean and what that looks like in like real case scenario for a victim of violence is that more often than not, you have a boyfriend, girlfriend, boyfriend, husband, wife, roommates, whatever it would look like. You have them in an apartment setting, a HUD funded property, and they get into an altercation, whether it be verbal, emotional, physical, any of them would qualify. And one party would want to leave, and we'll refer to them as the victim for this point. Victim would want to leave. Victim says, I'm not safe here and I want out of this property. So under VAWA, they cannot be evicted solely on the basis of violence that happened in the home or in the property. And again, like the unfortunate part about that is that a lot of times housing providers are not aware of what those rights are. And so by the time they come to, let's just say our agency as a domestic violence agency, a lot of times they've either already been evicted or they have been given like a 3-day notice for eviction. And then we have to kind of backtrack and work our way around it. So they cannot be denied admission, evicted, or assistance terminated. So for instance, if they were on Section 8 vouchers or any other type of HUD funded assistance based on a criminal history, an eviction record, or bad credit. So this, I would say, out of all the VAWA protections that we utilize on our end, I would say this one is not new, but it's the one that's more readily available. And so a lot of times when you think about domestic violence and you think about violence in the home, you think about the economical piece that Darianne talked about in the financial, right? And so you think about a husband and a wife, again, just we'll use that scenario, that relationship. And we think about we'll use the husband in this term. The husband is the victim and he wants to leave and he says, I'm done, I'm gone. And he goes to apply for a HUD funded property, and the HUD funded property goes and runs a background check. They run a credit report, and all of a sudden he has this credit that is just tanked because once he left, the wife says, nope, not going to happen. And so we've seen like social security numbers being utilized to open like utility bills, bank accounts, checking accounts drained, credit cards maxed out to max capacity. And so a lot of times properties are not familiar with this protection, in that just because that is what it says on paper is not always the case. It's not always the person that's done it. And so what VAWA does is truly just kind of protects that person. And again, I think we're going to be seeing that more and more, just as, you know, violence continues to progress and it just continues to escalate in ways that we've never seen before, and people get more creative. And as Darianne said, technology is more readily available, and the things that you can do with technology are just astounding. But that one's going to be a big one that you guys probably are going to see with some of your clients if you have not already. So victims under VAWA protections, they must have the option to stay. And so I would say about half and half. We see victims that want to stay, and then probably the other half want to leave. And so where that gets very, very cloudy is that, again, landlords are not necessarily aware that the victim has that right. And so, for instance, we just had a young lady come to the shelter with her son, and she said, I want to relocate. I need to go back to family out of state. And I said, okay, no problem. You know, I said, what are some things that we need to put in place before you go? And she was very concerned about the lease. Now, she had said that her boyfriend also had to sign off the lease in order for her to be taken off that lease, right? Because again, landlords look at it that, you know, if two people are on the lease and one person just says, I'm done, I want out, the other party is not necessarily aware that they are solely then responsible for that payment every month. And so under VAWA, they have the option to stay, but also what you will see is that they also have the option to leave. And I think that, again, is where we see some of the bigger issues. And so they have the right to request an emergency transfer from the housing provider for safety reasons. And I will say that VAWA, to my knowledge, VAWA is not like 100% clear on if in fact a victim or survivor, if they can be transferred just solely within that unit or within that property, or if they have the right to actually, if it protects them to physically leave the property. Now, I will say this is where you guys come into huge pieces of it, because you've built that relationship with the landlords, you have built that relationship with the providers, and a lot of times that relationship goes a very long way. And so most of the time we're able to get people out of the actual unit. And sometimes people want to stay in the actual unit that they're in. They just want a different apartment, which again, VAWA 100% would protect against that transfer. So they must be allowed to move with continued assistance. So any of you that work with any voucher type programs, you know the paperwork that can sometimes go into it. And so we see a lot of times housing providers are kind of putting up that, well, your Section 8 voucher, your voucher is good for this place and this place only. But again, VAWA clearly states that that is not the case, that it can follow them. And it can be done very smoothly, uncomplicated. But again, that's where those kind of relationships go hand in hand with the providers that you have. So a few other ones. So one of the big things for a victim or survivor, if they are requesting VAWA protections, is that they have to be able to provide proof to the housing provider by self-certifying. And I'll link, we'll go at the end here, we'll link to kind of that HUD page with these forms, but for reference, it is spelled from, not form, sorry for the typo. It is HUD form 5382. And so we have yet to run in on our end where they've requested more information. So you can see there that unless there's conflicting information, they are not required to provide any other information. And so that self-certification can come from a variety of people. So it can come from the client themselves. It can come from law enforcement. It can come from the courthouse. It can come from a doctor, from a psychiatrist. It can come from the domestic violence agency. It can come from a lot of places. And that again is where we run into, and we'll kind of look at some of those issues here as we go on. But I would say that is a lot of times where we run into, because most housing providers have their perception of what violence looks like. And so to most people, violence looks like you're telling me that this person is violent to you and you're needing to leave. So where's your order of protection? Well, anybody that's worked with a victim of violence knows that there's a lot of reasons why people don't get orders of protection. And so that's a conversation that we have to have quite regularly. It's kind of an education piece, just because it doesn't always look like what we think it should. So the client has to receive HUD's notice of VAWA housing rights. And that is HUD form 5380 and form 5382. But I will tell you, I would look at a client's lease, because more often than not, those forms are actually not in there, which is interesting to me, because it is a federal law in place, HUD funded. So those forms are not in there. Occasionally, providers will have their own type of form, and it will be similar to the self-certifying form, but it is in fact not the self-certifying form from HUD, but they should have that in there. So they have the right to confidentiality, which again, when you think about anybody, like take violence out of it, right? Like nobody wants anybody to know their business. And so that confidentiality piece is kind of exasperated when you think about a victim of violence. And so they have that right to confidentiality. They can't go agency to agency to try to request this information, which again, unfortunately, we have seen, which ultimately puts a victim or survivor at some pretty significant risk. So they can request a lease verification. And so what that means is that they do have the right to separate. So this is where that one party has to sign off on a lease in order for the other party to be taken off the lease. So this is where that piece comes into it, is that they can, under HUD or under VAWA, actually separate from that lease, even if there are not two signatures in place. And so you guys might see that more readily when you kind of work with VAWA, but I would say, very often we see that is where somebody will say, well, I can't be taken off the lease because they said both parties have to sign. And then that's where we kind of pull up those VAWA protections. And it's very clear as to what VAWA supports and what VAWA protects. Cannot be coerced, intimidated, threatened, or retaliated against. And this is in reference to the housing provider. And so what we historically have seen, which is unfortunate, is that we have seen the use of social services where social services wasn't required. So if you leave my property, we are going to call social services and have your kids removed. Like that factually has come out of housing providers' mouths, which is just beyond me. But yeah, there's a million different things. Or if you, even something as simple as, well, if you stay, you know, we'll decrease your rent by $200, right? Still that intimidation of if you leave, right? Not giving them that option to leave if they really wanted to. And then has the right to seek law enforcement or emergency assistance. So I don't know if we have any housing providers on here, but if you talk to a housing provider, they will tell you that they don't prefer law enforcement to be at their building for a lot of reasons. But victims of violence have that right, as does everybody. Violence or not, everybody has that right, but specifically unto VAWA, they have that right to seek law enforcement if they have an immediate need for safety or concern. They have that right for law enforcement. And sometimes it's as complex as there are weapons involved, there's kidnapping, there's somebody barricaded in a back room, or it can be as simple as we got into an argument. I need to leave, but I don't know if I'm safe to leave without law enforcement here. Law enforcement will come and do a standby, or they'll help transport to a different location. So it can be as simplistic or as complex as you can imagine.
Heather, we have some questions.
Perfect.
First one, in the event there is a two-party household, say husband and wife, where the husband abuses the wife, when a landlord allows the wife to move, does that then remove all financial obligations from the wife?
It does. And so that's part of where that verification comes into, is that the victim has the right, that wife would have the right in that setting to say, I no longer want to be here. It is not safe here for me. And again, as long as it's a HUD funded property, a valid protected property, they absolutely have that right to say, I'm done. I want nothing else to do with this place. And usually a landlord's gonna have a documentation that they can sign off on that. And I would encourage and recommend that they have the documentation signed off on, that there's a physical piece of paper that says they are not responsible for any dollars owed.
Okay, next one. Are you saying that landlords cannot deny admission to a HUD approved apartment due to eviction, criminal history, and bad credit?
If they can prove that the bad credit, criminal history, if they can prove that it was directly related to a violent altercation, being that they themselves are the victim and or survivor, that is correct. Now, that's not to say that, everybody coming into a HUD funded property says, I was a victim of such and such, and that's why I have this massive, bill that's in place, and why you're denying me. But if they can prove, and that's where VAWA comes in, if they can prove that either an eviction or criminal history, bad credit, if they can prove that was directly related to being a victim of violence, that is correct. And so I can give you an example of that. We actually had a lady in the shelter. She was here residing with us, her and her daughter, for just about 4 years. And she had an extensive amount of credit specifically to utilities. And she'd been denied, right? Like, we did our due diligence and we tried everything that we can think of until we were pointed to that exact point. Well, we were able to then track down when she originally fled the home of violence. She fled to a sober living home. And then from the sober living home, after detox, she was able to get into a domestic violence center and get support and help there. But while she was in those two residences, that's where I was talking about the social security number, her husband, legal husband, then took her number and opened, I'm going to say it was like 10 different utilities at the time, and paid nothing on it, racked it up and paid nothing on it. So it defaulted to her, which to a housing provider, without knowing the background story of it, it looks like she's really bad at managing her money, right? But again, that's where VAWA would come in and say, those protections are in place for a reason. She 100% had zero control over what had happened when she wasn't even there. And so, ultimately we were able to get her into a HUD funded property, but it did take some substantial documentation. I will say that.
Okay, and then this one's kind of a 2-3-part question, maybe. Who makes the landlord accountable?
Great question. So Darianne will be the first to tell you that I'm really good at being a pain in the ass in people's lives. And so I mean that in the most professionally way possible, but you guys get to be the ones that hold them accountable, right? Like, you can call HUD, but anybody who's worked with HUD knows that nothing quick happens with HUD, right? And so best way I would say is to educate yourself on the law, educate yourself on VAWA, and to have it black and white in front of you. we have had to utilize, so if you're familiar with CAUSE, which is the Domestic Violence Coalition for the state, they have attorneys on hand that we've had to utilize on that end if there is non-compliance from a landlord. But a lot of times nobody likes black and white evidence, right? If it's one thing if you're just talking, you know, face to face and you're saying, well, this is what the law says, but it's a whole nother level if you put it in front of them and say, this is a federal law that you have to abide by. You more often than not get compliance, but I will say we have definitely had to utilize an attorney in order to get things straight.
Okay. And then what are the stats for high class, middle class? Because it seems like it's more for the lower class that it's geared for.
Sure. So I don't know stats. I will tell you that. I can give you on what we see here on a daily basis in all the years that I've done this work. And I can tell you that lower class is usually the more prevalent one to report. Now, that's not to say that higher class does not by any means report. Usually it just historically has shown that lower class populations tend to report. Or I'm going to throw this, and I don't mean this to start a debate by any way, but I will just say, like, when you think about stereotyping and you think about biases, you know, who is going to call the police because you hear your neighbor who is, you know, a pharmacist and a school teacher, right? Like who's going to call your neighbor on that versus if you have a lower class who maybe works at Walmart and is a single mom and the boyfriends are residing there, right? And I just kind of use those examples just because, again, like, it's unfortunate, but that's stereotypically what we see. But I can sure see if I can gather some stats if you would like.
I think that is it for right now.
Okay. So here are a list of programs covered. I'm not the expert in housing programs. I'm not even going to pretend to be, but I did want to list them just so you guys are familiar with what the programs are that are covered. So public housing, housing choice voucher, Section 8 project based, and so that could either be the moderate rehabilitation, single room occupancy, Section 202 supportive housing for the elderly, Section 202 direct loan, Section 811 supportive housing for persons with disabilities, housing opportunities for persons with AIDS, the HOPWA program, the home program, ESG programs, COC programs, and then Section 221, which is the below market interest rate for multifamily rental assistance, Section 236 multifamily assistance, housing trust fund. And so what I will tell you is, you know, those of you that work in these programs, you are the experts, right? Like you know these programs, the ins and outs. And so on top of VAWA, I guess I would also point your direction is that some of those programs also have other clauses, other laws, other protections that are in place. So when you work in those programs, I would just say make sure that you know what those are as well, because if you need to use more than VAWA, then there is more in VAWA that's in place. So just make sure you know, and I'm sure, you know, you guys work in those programs, and so you know the ins and outs of them. So don't be afraid to use them. So some of the issues that we run into, and that's kind of why I showed that video at the very beginning, because the most common question that we get is, why don't they leave? They have the option to leave. Why don't they leave? And so we don't use statistics a whole lot, but I will say the one that we use quite regularly, and I would honestly say that it is probably not sufficient. I would say that it's probably longer at this point, but the two most dangerous years a victim of violence will experience is the 2 years when they finally leave an abusive relationship. So what that means is that all of the threats, all of the promises that were in place, they come true, right? So that's when you see the child abductions. That's when you see the murder suicide. That's when you see a million different scenarios that you read about and you hear about. Those are usually after somebody leaves that violent situation. And the other thing that if you ask, I would go out on a limb and almost guarantee, if you ask any victim, any survivor of any violent scenario, they will tell you that it is safer to stay because they know what to expect, right? I know when I go home, I'm going to be punched in the face. I know when I go home, I'm going to be told this. I know when I go home, fill in the blank, but when you leave that situation, it's unpredictable, right? And so I show that video at the very beginning because you see how convoluted, if you don't work in the realm of domestic violence or sexual assault or human trafficking or dating violence or stalking, if you don't work in it, it's very hard to see, or it's very hard to take a step back and say, oh, wait a minute, like there's more to be said for it, right? And so you heard the one lady say that never leaves physical marks, and that children are the ones that are being coerced into doing the offending, right? And so you can't blame a child, but if you can't prove it, you can't blame the adult either, right? And so how hard is it for somebody to come to a housing provider and say, I need out of this place because I'm being abused? And unfortunately, housing providers will say, well, where are the marks, right? Because most people historically think of, society tells us, when you think about domestic violence, you think about the bruises, right? You think about the physical element of it, but you don't always think of the other pieces into it. And so that's where some of our advocating has to come in, because sometimes it's an education piece, right? Like we don't know what we don't know. And so sometimes it's simply educating providers to say, well, wait a minute, there's more to domestic violence than just the physical blows. So here's some of the issues that we have faced. So a lot of times we've run into housing providers will say that, well, they never called the police, so it didn't exist, right? If there's no police report, there's no violence. Which again, there's a lot of reasons why people don't call the police. And so there's not always going to be a police report in place. And this is where it comes down to the self-certification, is that it doesn't always have to be a police report, right? There's other documents, there's other things that in place that you can provide to the housing provider to prove that there is violence in place. No order of protection in place. I would say this is the number one question we get asked when we try to assist somebody to get out of a residence, and they say, well, you need to provide the order of protection. That could be a disorderly conduct restraining order. It could be a domestic violence protection order. It could be a sexual assault restraining order, criminal no contact. But again, there are reasons why somebody might not have a protection order in place. Some of it might be as complex as, when you think about it, a protection order is a simple piece of paper that is only good if the person is going to abide by it. And so sometimes an order of protection actually exacerbates the situation and it makes things substantially worse. So there might not be an order of protection in place, but I would say almost number one question we always get asked is there an order of protection in place, and when can you provide it to me? You heard me talk quite a bit about the landlord is not aware of VAWA protections. And so I use the example of that mom and little kiddo that I just worked with in the last couple of weeks here. And when I had called the landlord to see, if they had VAWA documentation that I could assist the client in filling out, she was like, I actually have no idea. My supervisor will be back and we'll give you a call back. And so people just aren't aware of it. But again, it's there for a reason. And if in fact it's not in a lease, it's not in a copy of their rights, again, HUD provides it perfectly on their website. All the documentations are there that you can assist somebody in filling out. And that's part of that self-certification. So this is a big one. We've talked a lot about HUD funded properties, but what about the properties that are not funded by HUD? And so that gets very tricky because again, not all properties are HUD funded. Therefore, not all properties are VAWA protected. Now, I will say the properties that are not VAWA protected, I think have learned along the way. And so they do have some type of clause that's in place for victims of violence. It might not be as elaborate as the VAWA protections, but I would say often there is something else in place. The other thing, because VAWA is a federal law in place, most of those non-funded HUD properties are actually willing to look at the VAWA documents because they're they're pretty simple, but they provide the information that's needed to kind of assist somebody to get out of that situation. So just know that even though they're not HUD funded, they either usually have something else in place or they are willing to look at those VAWA documents.
Can I jump in and do this one, Heather?
Sure.
Okay. So they don't believe the victim or survivor because of the repeat coming and going. And there's just one thing that everyone should know, and that is it usually takes 7 times for a woman to leave before she will actually leave for good. And Heather talked a little bit about why women don't leave. It's also why men don't leave. It's also why same-sex relationships, why someone doesn't leave. It's because they're embarrassed or ashamed. And some, they love each other in a very strange way. I know I've heard that over and over, but I love him, but I love him. And I truly believe that is the truth. And when you love somebody, you know, you want to change them. You want to help them to be better. You want things to go well. And so many times they think that if they stay in the situation, maybe possibly they can help them to change. There's still that family expectations where, you know, if you married them, then it's till death do you part. Unfortunately, a lot of religions expect that. And so when you don't have the support of your family to help you leave, or to even for them to understand why you need to leave, it's very difficult. Financial is another big reason. If you have not worked, or if you are not able to get a job where you're able to make enough money to take care of yourself and your children, it is very, very difficult to leave. And usually in a situation where there's been domestic violence for a number of years, the isolation that has taken place has probably alienated most of the family and friends that this person has had. And so it is very difficult because you have no one. And so many times that's when they do reach out to us. I remember talking to a young woman once, and I, you know, I'm always very proud of all of the services we can offer and all of the things that we can do. And I remember her looking at me and saying, coming here was the last thing I wanted to do. It makes me feel useless. It makes me feel like I can't do anything, so I have to come to you. And so it kind of made me think differently about how I thought we were so wonderful and we could do so many good things, when the victim is looking at us as like the last resort. Like they don't want to be here, but they don't know what else to do. And I think the number one reason that they don't leave is the children. You want your children to have both parents, and you want to be a happy family in everyone's eyes. And so a lot of times people will stay together in a domestic violence relationship until the kids grow up. But it is a fact that it is better for children to have no father or mother than to have a violent father or mother. My 2 cents, Heather.
Thanks. Appreciate it. So the other one on that is dual arrest. So if you've ever worked with law enforcement, they will tell you that one of the hardest things to do when they arrive to a domestic, especially if it is a domestic that they've been at prior to, it is really hard to establish who the primary aggressor is. And sometimes it's not till days after of the de-escalation and kind of working with people to figure out what the real scenario was. But unfortunately, they still have their report in place. And so when a victim goes to get, or a survivor goes and gets that police report to submit with that self-certification, a lot of times it doesn't necessarily show that they themselves are the victim, which again is where providers get that conflicting information from, where they might request more information. And so in that regard, that might be where they request information from us as the domestic violence provider if they've accessed our services, or a doctor if a victim went in and had any medical reason to be seen, or if they were to see a counselor or any other medical professional for that matter, social services. That's where you see those further documents being requested. So I may have any questions before I take you to this link here. Anything else in the chat, Kylie?
Sorry, I couldn't get unmuted.
That's okay.
It says, I'm sorry, are you stating that you've had experience luck with getting VAWA protections for folks at non-HUD funded properties?
That's correct. So they don't necessarily view it as VAWA, but a lot of times, because VAWA is federal, if you can look at a document and you can provide the correct documentation, and that's, I think, where the difference is that VAWA for HUD funded properties, documentation can be very limited as far as assisting a victim. However, when you work with non-funded HUD properties, sometimes the documentation that they require needs to be a little bit more expansive. So I would say that would be the big difference. But like I said, I think people are more willing to listen if you can prove or show them something in front of you, especially if it is federal. So when I was talking about HUD had kind of redone some of their, so most of you, if not all of you, have been to HUD.gov. So January, February of this year, they did a new portal specific to VAWA. So everything on this page here is for VAWA alone. And so I left it as it is before clicking out of this. So anybody who has ever gone to any type of domestic violence website, you will always usually get this precursor, or you will see, if I close out of here, you will see this exit site button at the top here, and that is for safety reasons. It doesn't track to where somebody has been if they've been trying to get help. So HUD did a great job in making sure that that was in place there, but I just kind of wanted to show you this site here for your reference. So that, again, like I said, this is all VAWA. And so what I specifically want to show you is that these VAWA forms, so all of the forms that I had talked about are on here. And the one thing that you will see here is that they are available in multiple languages, which, again, anybody who's worked in North Dakota for the last few years, you've seen that population significantly increase of non-English speaking clients. And so that's been a huge for us. You'll see, yeah, model for emergency transfer plan. So if they needed to be transferred out, the certification for domestic violence or dating violence, sexual assault or stalking, and alternate documentation, all those documents are there. And so when I talk about sometimes you have to pull those documents in place because providers are not aware of them, they are all readily available. They are fillable forms, meaning that you can kind of plug in the correct information. So I would encourage you at some point to just go to this site and kind of play around with them and look and see what they're like. But again, like they're pretty simplistic. They're pretty easy to use. Anybody can use them if you're working with a client. It doesn't have to be a domestic violence provider or law enforcement, or it can be you can help them do the self-certification. So these are forms that are great to kind of have in place. I just wanted to take you to the site to let you know that it does exist and it's here for your service. And then I will just put back up here. I think that's kind of all we had for you guys, but I know that we had kind of just to wrap it up here. So the big thing I would say is don't be afraid to advocate for your clients, right? They come to you for a reason, and sometimes you are their last hope, as Darianne said, or you're their only resort. And so truly don't be afraid to advocate for them. You are the professional and they are not. The other thing there is don't be afraid to challenge authority or knowledge of where they work. Again, and I caveat that with saying most people are unknowing in the areas they have the least amount of experience with. So what we see on our end specifically is those valid documents, and more people are willing to listen. Again, if you have that black and white document in front of you and you can say, this is what the law says, versus just having a phone call with them and saying, well, we don't do anything with VAWA. We don't do anything to help the victim. We've heard that before. If you can ask for a copy of the lease, 9 times out of 10 your client has them, but if your client gives you permission, if they don't, to get a copy of it, you can look and see. And more often than not, that valid documentation or wording is in that lease as part of protections. And so again, like in the most professional way possible, but don't be afraid to challenge it, because again, people are unfamiliar with what they don't know. So. And then here's some information for Darianne and I. If you guys have any questions after we're done here, like I said, we're not experts by any means, but combined knowledge, we've been doing it for a long time and continue to learn and continue to ask the hard questions. So if we didn't answer something that you would like answered, feel free to give us a call or shoot us an email. And we will yield any questions if there are any.
Somebody just stated, I would also suggest reaching out to High Plains Fair Housing Center which deals with housing discrimination, including clients experiencing domestic violence or under VAWA. They are HUD funded and serve all of North Dakota.
Yep, great agency.
Heather, I just realized I had the wrong email address for you.
That's okay. I got your other one too, so you're safe.
Perfect. Does anybody else have any questions? If not, we will, this session, we were able to reschedule one of our sessions that we had to cancel earlier this spring. So mark your calendars for July 11th. We will be having Katie Joe with Grand Forks Housing Authority presenting on innovative housing solutions. So there, you be on the lookout for that email with the Zoom link and whatnot, probably late next week. With that, thank you, Heather and Darianne, for presenting and taking time out of your schedules. We really, truly appreciate it. Thank you all for attending today's session. Reminder, the survey will be sent out, so if you could just take a couple minutes and provide any feedback, questions, comments, future topics that you would like to have presented. We greatly appreciate that feedback. So please take a couple minutes and fill out that survey. Also, if you need a certificate of completion, please email Stacy and she will get that sent out to you. So thank you again, Heather and Darianne, for presenting. And I hope everybody has a wonderful and safe 4th of July.